Hey everybody. So the title of our study is Assessing Anti-Predator Behavior in Urban Backyard Birds. Now, the researchers for this project are Hannah Bell, Angelica Solano, Joshua Cooper, and myself, David Willis. So the world population, it has increased drastically since the 1800s. And with this comes larger cities, comes more cities, and less natural places. Now, the animals that once lived in these natural places, they're now being forced to adapt to these newer urban environments. And with these new urban environments come novel predator-prey interactions. So that's really what we're looking at in this study. And, it's a really interesting and a newer field of study in wildlife behavior because with such a dramatic change in environment, going from natural habitat to now urban habitat, these animal behaviors are expected to change. So the overall goal of this project specifically is to study anti-predator behavior in urban backyard birds. And we'll basically do this by bringing the birds in with feeders, and then exposing them to novel and natural predators, and then just look at their reactions, study their reactions. With this, we really hope to build upon past research and discover some new findings on the behaviors of urban birds. We hypothesized that the natural predator replica, it would elicit the strongest anti-predator behavior from these urban birds. And this is really because of something called fixed action patterns. These are actions that species are basically programmed to do. It's hardwired in their brain. So our thinking is that when these birds, see these historic natural predators, they will, naturally avoid the area more so than the novel predators.
The increased development of urban areas plays a crucial role in the understanding of wildlife behaviors. As human populations rapidly increase, houses must be constructed to properly accommodate the growing numbers. As urban areas develop, this places a challenge on many species that previously inhabited the region. These organisms must evolve and adapt to meet the challenges of their new environment. As urban areas expand, many species are excluded from the environment. However, this is not the case for many bird species and presents a unique niche where homeowners will feed local birds and predation is lessened. These birds are a collection of individuals that have either traveled to the area or were born and raised in urban development and have rarely interacted with predators and likely experienced a reduction in predation pressure because of urban development. This presented a novel opportunity to observe the behavioral differences of urban bird species and compare them to wild population reactions based on previous literature. The purpose of the experiment was to determine the interaction between these birds and an artificial natural predator and a commonly available bird deterrent. The predicted outcomes of the experiment were that there would be a change in behavior from the birds when either deterrent was present, which would result in predator avoidance through flushing and reduced presence. It was also predicted that the birds may experience aggression towards the deterrents as some larger birds can become territorial. And a final assumption was that the birds would not change their behavior in the presence of a deterrent. The literature supports our hypothesis in that a natural predator elicits a stronger anti-predator response in urban bird species as opposed to other forms of disturbance. One such publication is that of an experiment conducted on 58 rural and urban house sparrows collected in Hungary, where their response to both natural and unnatural predators was observed and analyzed. The experiment was designed such that the birds were placed in cages, and a taxidermy feral cat and a taxidermy sparrowhawk were passed in front of the cage to elicit anti-predator avoidance responses. A cardboard box was also used and passed in front of the cage to determine the control response. The results indicated that sparrows had an increased avoidance behavior as compared to individuals captured in rural areas. Moreover, the researchers concluded that despite being rural or urban, all groups demonstrated an increased anti-avoidance behavior to the sparrowhawk, and no significant difference was observed between the control and the feral cat. Another study conducted in Canterbury, New Zealand tested the effectiveness of two visual bird scarers on startling predation of wild Ryling grapes in vineyard blocks. The scares consisted of a marketed deterrent called the Peaceful Pyramid, which was a motorized spinning pyramid with reflective panels, and the other was an eye spot balloon. The researchers found the balloon was more effective, but after 24 days, 75% of the grapes in the balloon plot had been damaged from the birds, thereby rendering both methods inadequate artificial deterrents. Another similar study conducted in Canada during June of 2008 was used to determine the effectiveness of three popular commercial bird deterrent devices on starlings over a blueberry field during harvest season, when the birds were most abundant. The deterrents used consisted of an auditory bird distress caller, a propane cannon, and a hawk kite. Monitoring occurred 2 weeks before and after the deterrents were installed. There were 3 control stations throughout the study and 3 variable stations, each with one of the 3 deterrents. The study lasted 4 months, and analysis showed that the hawk kite and the propane cannon were the most effective deterrents initially, decreasing the storm's presence. The conclusion was that the hawk kite was the most effective deterrent as it reduced the starling numbers the greatest and for the longest period of time. Overall, these studies show, through various research methods, that there appears to be a greater anti-predator response to that of a natural predator even when artificial deterrents are used. The premise behind our experiment is based upon that of similar studies by which urbanization reduces predation risk, and therefore homeowners as well as agriculturalists must use artificial deterrents to prevent birds from eating their crops and gardens. This can be correlated with a known phenomenon known as the safe habitat hypothesis, by which the level of urbanization affects the abundance of natural predators, and as a result, the populations of birds increase due to reduced nest predation and higher fertility rates. With reduced predation, the birds can become habituated to humans and desensitized to their changing surroundings that consist of excess noise and light pollution. Individuals bred in these conditions may never encounter natural predators and only experience predation pressure from domesticated pets such as house cats. Therefore, the question was asked, what are the behavioral responses of these birds that have been subjected to these unnatural conditions? Homeowners often purchase wind chimes and other ornaments and place them near their bird feeders, which further contribute to noise pollution and are visually alarming for birds. If the birds have little exposure to natural predators and experience excess stimuli daily, would there be a fair response for deterrence? Is there an ancestral fear response of flight or fight in these animals that will be triggered with certain deterrents regardless of lack of exposure? Would an artificial deterrent even elicit a response, and if so, what type of deterrent would elicit a greater response? Based upon previous literature, we hypothesized that a deterrent resembling a natural predator would elicit a greater response than that of artificial deterrents, and we designed the experiment to test this hypothesis.
Alright, so as far as our study design, what we did was we collected data over a 4-week period, where our first week would be a control week, so the feeder with no treatment, no deterrent. Second week, we placed our first deterrent, which was the owl replica in very close proximity to the feeder. And then on week 3, we removed the owl, and it was back to control week, no deterrent. And then on week 4, we placed our second deterrent, which were the bird repellent discs. And we replicated our setup in 4 different locations, which were Clemson, South Carolina, Wilmington, North Carolina, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Hopewell, Virginia. As far as the materials goes, we all use the same materials, of course, to eliminate variation and account for, as much of variance as we could. And so we ordered the bird feeder, the repellent discs, and the owl from Amazon, and we got our wild bird feed from Walmart. And the owl was about 7-inch tall, not very large, as large as we would have liked. This is the ethogram that we designed based on previous literature and based on the behaviors that we thought we would see while we were out recording data. And so we have those anti-predator behaviors, which were avoidance, hesitation, aggression, and flushing. And then the normal behavior would be simply foraging. And these are like the descriptions for each of them. So basically the bird's avoiding the feeder at all, avoiding contact with it, attacking the repellent in some way, and whatnot. And so what we found was that 14 different species overall visited the 4 feeders. We found 4 different species visiting Clemson, which are the ones, circled with green. We had 6 species in Hopewell, Virginia. We had 8 species in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And we also had 8 species in Wilmington, North Carolina. And so on this table, we can see the aggregate means, so for all the locations, for each of the treatments, so we can see control, owl, and discs. And we recorded total visits per session, the maximum number of individuals that we saw at one time per session, and the total species that visited per session. And so here we can see that the mean for the control was always higher for each of these dependent variables, if you will. And then on this table, we overall see that Clemson and Baton Rouge got the highest number of visits per session for the control. And then it also appears that Clemson might have been an outlier for the owl deterrent. As you can see, there were no visits at all during that week, which could have been influenced by the weather, because precisely those days the weather was very foggy. It was very cold that whole week, so that could have had an influence. And then to see if there were if the differences between the control, the owl, and the discs were actually significant, we ran a one-way analysis of variance. And so we did this ANOVA to a standard significant level of 0.05. And so we found that for the total number of visits, we did find a significant difference. So here you see circled in red our F value and our significance level. So there was a significant difference for this dependent variable. We did not find a significant difference in the maximum number of individuals at one time per session. And we did find that the total number of species was significant. There were significant differences between the three treatments. So here's our F value again and our significance. So it was interesting that we did not find a significant difference in the maximum number of individuals, because we could hypothesize that maximum number of individuals would be reduced with the treatments based on where boldness and age class would play a role. So a more in-depth study could definitely tag individuals and examine which ones are coming or not during each treatment, and that could certainly provide more insight to this. So because we found these significant differences in total visits and total species, we conducted a post hoc analysis with Tukey's HSD. So we found that the total number of visits per session was significantly higher for the control versus the owl, and for the control versus the discs. However, the owl compared to the discs, we did not find a significant difference. So this somewhat agrees with our hypothesis and shows that the deterrents do elicit some type of anti-predator behavior. Again, the total number of species also was significant for control versus owl and control versus discs, and the same thing, no significant difference for either between owl and discs. And so finally, we also recorded, our anti-predator behaviors. So the control weeks didn't show any anti-predator behavior. The owl showed avoidance in terms of the birds not visiting the feeder at all, which again, we already mentioned weather could have played a role in this, but still. Also shorter visits, hesitation, and aggression behavior. And then the reflective discs showed avoidance behaviors where birds would visit but maintain their distance away from the feeder, so they actually ate what had fallen to the ground, as well as shorter visits. And also we saw aggression and flushing more often from the feeder.
All right, to kind of wrap things up, our findings. So we found that Baton Rouge and Wilmington had the highest species diversity, and then Baton Rouge and Clemson had the highest number of visits per session of individuals and individuals at the same time, so multiple at the feeder at one time. There was a significant difference between the control week and then the two deterrents, which we had predicted. And so more species, and there was a higher species diversity in the control weeks. There was really no significant difference between the two deterrents, so between the plastic owl and the plastic discs, which we had hypothesized that the plastic owl would have a greater anti-predator behavior, a higher or a quicker flush time, more avoidance, different behaviors like that. And they were really pretty similar in terms of behavior and number of visits for both deterrents. And so some of this could be due to the habituation, and also the owl was not large enough. So potentially a different owl could change those results and have a higher number of anti-predator behaviors with that. So the deterrent one was the plastic owl, and the bird showed three main different responses to the owl, which included some hesitation, aggression, and then just avoidance of the feeder altogether when they got close to the owl. This depended on the location of the owl to the feeder for some of us. The deterrent two was the plastic discs, and the bird showed similar responses to the owl. However, there was a number of visits that was never at zero, and the bird seemed to flush more often. And this could be because anytime the wind would blow, it would make a sound, which was a little bit more alarming to the birds versus just the plastic owl sitting there. But as this image shows us over here, um, plastic birds are often suggested to help keep away other bird species, and this image shows you that it's typically not successful. So you have birds that even sit on top of these fake owls. So something to keep in mind. In terms of our hypothesis and our findings, we found that our hypothesis was correct in that there was a higher anti-predator behavior with the deterrents. And we also hypothesized that the plastic owl would have a higher anti-predator behavior. And as I said in the previous slide, that's not the case. For our study concluded that there was really no difference between the plastic owl and the plastic discs. They both had roughly the same number of species visit them, the same species diversity, and the same type of behaviors. And our study is important because if you are say, bird owner and you're a bird feeder and you want certain types of birds at your feeder, or for whatever reason you don't want birds on your property, looking at with the two deterrents, which would be most likely to help you in not attracting birds, they were pretty much the same in our study. Beyond that, it was just interesting to look at the different species that we saw in 4 different locations in the Southeast, and really 4 different climates at the time, because in Virginia, it was snowing and rainy and windy and cold for most of the observations, which differs a little bit from the weather that the birds and the test site in Louisiana had. So some future considerations: more testing days, a longer testing period in general, more testing locations, especially moving away from just the concentrated southeast of the US, a longer period study, and with this, definitely looking at different seasons and seeing how the results differ depending on the season, and if there is a need for coming to the bird feeder in the winter, and how the behaviors are different from the summer when maybe they can forage on their own. A longer observation period, so different hours of the day, more hours than just the hour that we did, kind of placing a camera at the feeder so that we can observe a longer period of time, and maybe that will not spook the birds as much as us kind of trying to hide and be around the bird feeder to record it. And then also putting the deterrents at different locations and distances from the feeder and seeing the differences that they make, as well as height to the feeder. And we could look in the future at the different number or the different species and diversity of species that visit, since we had an array of species that did come to the various feeders, as well as look at the boldness of those different species and individuals coming, and also the size. So are the bigger birds being less intimidated by the deterrents than maybe a smaller, like house sparrow? different considerations like that. Here's our references. Thank you for watching our presentation. We hope you enjoyed it.